Okay, so I need to tell you a couple of things. First of all, about me and my background before I actually start talking about Turing. The first thing is that I'm not an expert on Turing. I do know a reasonable amount about the things that he did, but it's mostly the sorts of things that most people know. And as I've been reading more about him over the past couple of months, ready to come and give this talk, I've realized just quite how little I know. So I'm not an expert on Turing. In fact, there are a few people in the room who will know things that I don't know. And when we go into the Q&A, I might occasionally throw over to them and say, you know, can you add anything to this? Something that I learned just a little while ago was the person who was head of maths at Monash University while I was there actually worked with Turing in Hut 8 during the war. And we never knew that. And I'll talk about Hut 8 as we go along. But the thing is that, let me just ask, how many of you know, well, how many of you would say that you know a bit about Turing and what he did? Okay, so we're about half of you. That's exactly the pessimal situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down some historical context. I'm going to tell you some of the stories that people know. I'm going to give you some of the details. I'm not going to go into the mathematics of a lot of the code breaking that he did. And I'll basically go through his life. But I'm going to be talking a lot about Enigma because that's what people tend to know him for, but I will then also give you pointers to some of the other things. So I have crib notes here basically because I'm really lousy at remembering specific dates and that sort of thing. But Turing was born 100 years ago this year. So he was born, I think, in June 1912. So it's 100 years ago. His mother came from an engineering family. His father was a civil servant who was actually basically in India for most of his career. He was born in Paddington, and his parents were here when he was born, but then his father went back to India and his mother followed a little while after, and Turing went to boarding school. And in fact, it wasn't long after that, when Turing was 3, in 1915, that the first machine, which was the precursor of Enigma, was created, was invented. A rotor cipher machine, and the meaning of that will become clear a little later as I talk more about some of the details of the Enigma machine itself. So the rotor machine was actually invented in 1915. So that's, but it never really caught on. It never saw a great deal of commercial use. It was cranky, it was difficult to use, and it was used by the Dutch Navy, but that's about it. Then in 1918, at the end of the First World War, a guy called Arthur Scherbius actually patented a version which was much easier to use, Enigma A. And that, of course, was when Turing was 6 years of age. And Enigma A started to see some action. In particular, it was taken up in a commercial context. So a lot of banks and a lot of the large companies used it because they also, of course, want to send messages that people can't read. I mean, it would be, these days, of course, we have all of our communications encrypted as we do our online banking and everything else, and exactly the same concerns existed back then. So in 1918, Scherbius created Enigma A, patented Enigma A. It didn't really catch on. Again, you know, some of the big organizations used it. But then, in the early 20s, a lot of the people from the war started to write their memoirs. And the memoirs were being published in the early 20s. And the journalists got onto this and started to publicize this. And one of the things that they said repeatedly was, we could read the German codes. And the Germans went, oh really? We'd better do something about this. And so they went and they looked for a coding machine, a method of encoding their messages, and they lit upon the Enigma machine. So in the mid-20s, they actually started to use, in fact, in 1925, the German Navy adopted, again, a descendant of the Enigma machine, Enigma C. This, by the way, is a theme throughout, is that the Army and the Navy tended to do slightly different things. The Navy system tended always to be slightly more complicated than the Army one. You'll see that as we go along. So in 1925, the German Navy adopted Enigma as their method of communication. By the way, one of the journalists who was writing about the memoirs where people were saying we could read the German communication, one of the journalists who wrote about that was in fact Winston Churchill. So it was Churchill himself who ended up publicising the fact that it was possible to read the German communications, which caused the Germans to adopt Enigma, which then caused so many problems, because Enigma really is a very, very clever system. More than just the fact that it's difficult to break. The way that it works is incredibly elegant. And I will talk about that a little bit later, because one of the things that mathematicians always look for isn't just good solutions and solving problems. They're always looking for an elegant solution, something that's clean, something that works nicely and isn't just sort of a brute force method. You can have brute force coding solutions. Some of them are provably unbreakable. The one-time pad is known to be provably unbreakable. It's incredibly clever, but it's almost impossible to use in practice. I'm not going to talk much about the other encryption schemes. So anyway, Enigma was adopted in 1925. In 1926, Turing went to Sherborne School. Sherborne School was a public school, and it was looking for, his parents were of course looking to give him an education in classics. This is the sort of thing that the civil service wanted. This is the sort of thing that his father as a civil servant sort of wanted his children to do. And so he went along to Sherborne, and he did okay. I have a couple of quotations here. So for example, his housemaster says, "He has as good a brains as any boy that's been here, and they are good enough for him to get through even in useless subjects such as Latin, French and English." His mathematics master said, "Not very good. He spends a good deal of time apparently in investigations in advanced mathematics to the neglect of his elementary work. His work is dirty." And he was indeed not necessarily a very careful mathematician. But this is something that I find is some of the most brilliant mathematicians I've worked with often have a slapdash nature to what they do. They can be careful when they need to be, but when they're pursuing the ideas, you don't need to be careful in the detail. The ideas tend to work and then the detail can follow. And I can talk more about that later. I've had, it's both blessing and curse, but I've worked with people like Imre Leader, Bela Bolabash, Graham Brightwell and Tim Gowers, Sir Tim Gowers, recent Fields Medal winners. And I've watched them at work, and I know I am nowhere near their league. I can appreciate what they do and I can work with them, but they are amazingly clever. And finding the elegance and finding the way of thinking about these things and then doing the detail later is something that comes through in their work. Oh, one small story about when Turing started at Sherborne. It was 1926. It was the year of the general strike. And he had to get to Sherborne School, and the trains weren't running and the buses weren't, there was nothing running. So he cycled 60 miles. He stayed overnight at a pub on his own, on the way. And so he actually cycled all the way to Sherborne to make sure he could get there. This also is a theme that goes through. Turing was a quite gifted and hard-working athlete. I'll mention more about that a little bit later. So I've told you what his schoolmasters thought of his work, and he didn't do very well in some things. And in fact, the headmaster of the school said, "I hope he will not fall between two stools. If he is to stay at public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, he is wasting his time at public school." And yeah, it was felt that if you wanted to get on in civil service, you had to know the classics. That was the background that was expected, and he had little interest in the classics. He was clearly clever enough, but he was going his own way. Very much a lone thinker and very much an ideas man in his own right, who was then able to carry it through. Something else that happened at that time, which I will come back to in a little while, David Hilbert was one of the foremost mathematicians of the day. In 1901, he published a list of 23 problems. In fact, there were 24, but he thought that one of them wasn't important enough, so he didn't publish that one. It's been found, it's published, and he was probably right. But he published 23 problems which he felt were the most important mathematics problems of the day. Almost all of them have either been declared not really possible to be made precise, half of them have been declared as completely solved, some of them have been declared as partially solved, and one of them is as yet unsolved. And that's the Riemann hypothesis, and I will tell you a little bit about that if you ask me afterwards, if you care for the details. He published these 23 problems. Oh, by the way, as an echo of that, in the year 2000, the Clay Mathematics Institute published 7 problems. And unlike Hilbert felt that simply the kudos of solving these problems and gaining Hilbert's own appreciation was reward enough. The Clay Mathematics Institute has offered a $1 million bounty for each of these 7 problems, one of which has been solved. Grigori Perelman solved the Poincaré conjecture. He was offered the $1 million and he said no. He was offered a Fields Medal and he said no. And he's given up mathematics and gone to live with his mother. So no eccentricity there then. So anyway, in 1920, this is normal for mathematicians. No, it's not normal for mathematicians. Yes, it is, says a mathematician. So anyway, in 1928, Hilbert also published an outstanding problem, which is called the decision problem. It's closely related to one of his original 23. And the question was, given a collection of axioms and given your normal mathematics, if I give you a problem, an equation to solve, or some sort of well-defined problem, can we have a decision method, an algorithm for solving that, whatever that means? And in 1928, there was no concept, really, of what an algorithm was, not formally, certainly. And so Hilbert published that problem. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the German. I've been practicing it for a week, and I still can't do it, so I'm not going to do that. Also in 1928, the German army adopted the Enigma machine. Another descendant, in this case it was Enigma D. So all of these things are happening at the same sort of time. Turing is starting school, obviously doing well enough, but not terribly well. Hilbert is producing some interesting questions in mathematics, and the Germans are adopting the Enigma machine as their main means of communication. So as it turns out, the other thing is that in 1929, the guy who patented the Enigma machine died in the 1929 equivalent of a car accident. He was in a horse-drawn carriage and the horses bolted. He got thrown off and died of his injuries. I don't know if it was an instant death or a little while later. When you do this talk for school kids, they want to know. You know, but you probably, some of you do as well. I don't know. I haven't gone and looked up the gory details. And guess what? In 1930, there was yet another military version of the Enigma machine. I think that was Enigma I. I haven't made a note of it here. And so 1930 saw the adoption of what turned out to be basically the Enigma machine that Turing ended up working on. And you know, this is a long time before the start of the war. This is 1930, so we're still nearly a decade away from the start of World War II. In 1931, Turing had graduated from Sorbonne School, and despite the fact that it was claimed that he wasn't very good at maths and kept going his own way and his work was dirty, in fact he was accepted to study mathematics at Cambridge. He went to King's College and made a bit of a name for himself there. He graduated with honours from King's in mathematics, and he was recognised as being a very, very good mathematician. An unusual mathematician in the fact that he sort of didn't simply do the work that was presented and learn the techniques that were given, but he did have his own way of approaching things. He was clearly an inventive thinker in terms of the mathematics that he did. And so that was, he started there in 1931. And in 1932, the Poles started to get a bit concerned about Germany. So this is, again, the very early 30s. They could see what was happening in Germany at the time. And so they started up the Cipher Bureau, and they started to try to examine the Enigma machine and the ciphers that the Germans were using. Now, this is quite tricky because any kind of cipher system that you use, you want to keep it secret. These days, so just flipping to modern day cryptography for a moment, there are two major components in cryptography. One is the method that you use, and the other is the secret key that you have. And it's generally recognized that trying to keep secret the method you're using is bound to be a bad idea. It's called security through obscurity, and it's pretty certain that people will figure out what you're doing. So what you need to do is have what we call a large key space. We might have a well-defined, publicized, peer-reviewed process for communicating, but you and I share a secret. And the system that we use requires that secret. And anybody who doesn't have that secret can't read the message. And I'll come back to that in a little while, because the Enigma machine is the method. And certainly that became well known. I mean, in the mid-20s, you could actually just go and buy one of these things. They were being sold as a commercial prospect. The military versions became a bit more difficult to get a hold of. But the system of encryption was certainly fairly well known. Some of the details, not so much. But it's the setup that ended up being the main challenge. And you need to have a big setup. Again, flipping all the way back, the Caesar cipher says, write down your message, and then for every letter, just write down the letter in the alphabet that's 3 places further on, or 5 places further on. So you basically just shift the alphabet. Now, there's only 25 possibilities, because if you don't shift it, it's not very secure. But you can see that the amount of shift is the secret that you have to share, but there's not many that you have to try. And if you want to, I can actually go through the progression from the Caesar shift cipher through all of the ciphers that have been done up to the Enigma machine. And you can see that it's a descendant of a very long process as you go through things like Playfair, Vigenère, and other polyalphabetic ciphers. Again, I'll do that in question time if you're interested. So in 1932, the Polish Cipher Bureau started to look seriously at the Enigma machine. But they didn't have one. They needed one. And in particular, what they needed was the secret messages that were being sent so that it could analyze the messages and try and work out what was happening. Step up, a rather disinfected brother of somebody who was senior in the military. Again, I can never remember this guy's name, Hans Thilo Schmidt. But had fallen on hard times, but his brother was quite senior in the military, and so his brother gave him a job, very menial job, of destroying all of the cipher messages. So they get messages in cipher, they decrypt them, and then these were handed off to Thilo Schmidt to be destroyed. And he didn't. He sold them to the French. And the French passed them to the Polish. So suddenly the Poles had the data that they needed to be able to construct not only a copy of the machine, but actually to try and figure out the settings within the machine. And so those details that were being passed through enabled in particular there were 3 very, very clever Polish mathematicians, but the one who ended up, they took one of them, Rajowski, and Marian Majowski, and they actually kind of locked him in a room and gave him all the messages and said, here, you figure it out. And he did. And this was a phenomenal thing. And he actually managed to work out how to actually pry from the messages, their secrets. I'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the work that Turing did. The Poles got there first because they actually wanted to decode these because they knew that something was coming. They knew something was going to happen. And so they were working on that. And so the Enigma messages were passed through, goal scored. So the messages were being passed through. And in fact, Rejewski managed to sort out. I need to tell you a little bit about the way the Enigma machine works. Some of you already know this. I'll do this in more detail later. But what you have is a scrambling system that is an in and out scrambling system. And you set it up and you start with a letter here, you send it through the system, it comes back as a different letter. And then you change the settings and do it again. And then you change the settings and you do it again. If you didn't change the settings, then this would just be a normal substitution cipher. Exactly the kind of thing that you get in newspapers, which you can solve using frequency analysis. You know, E turns up 13% of the time, so whatever letter turns up the most is probably not E because they do that to fool you, right? T is the next most common, and A, R, I, O, I, S, H, and so on. So basically it's a scrambling system, and the scramble keeps changing. And it changes by having a rotor inside the system. And Rejewski actually managed to figure out all of the rotor settings. Still didn't know how they were set up to start with on a given day, or which order they were in on a given day, but that's what they then started to work on, and that's what they managed to do. Now, there were 3 rotors that fitted into the machine, so there were 6 possible orderings of the rotors. The rotors have a position for each of the letter of the alphabet. So there's 26 positions for each of the 3 rotors. So 26 cubed is 17,576. No, I didn't just work that out, I have remembered it. But actually it's not that bad, because it's about 25 cubed plus a bit. And that's quite easy to work out. So anyway, there's 17,500 settings for that. The rotors can go in any of 6 settings. So that's 100,000 ways that you can set up the rotors. These days, that's not a very big key space. You can actually do that very, very quickly these days. But of course, back then they couldn't. But they built a machine that could. They built a machine that they called the Bombe. And that had a cylinder, and each cylinder corresponded to one of the possible settings of the rotors in terms of which order they went in. And then it spun, and it tried all of the combinations of the positions of the rotors. And they could figure out what was impossible, which then gave them a small collection that they sifted through by hand. And I will talk a little bit more about this again. Some of these ideas, by the way, they sound simple enough until you try and actually do the detail. And then you find that they're really hard. And so I will revisit them to give you a chance to absorb what's going on and then have a look at it later. I'm not going to try and teach you everything about how these things work. You can go away and look that up yourself, or ask me afterwards for what I know. I don't actually know all of this stuff either, so we can do that. But anyway, by 1933, the Poles actually had a complete working replica of the Enigma machine, even though they'd never seen one. They managed to construct a working replica of the Enigma machine, which I think is a stunning achievement. And they worked out all of the wiring of the rotors, and they dropped the rotors in, and they started to try and decode messages, and it didn't work. And what had happened was, in the commercial system, they had a QWERTY keyboard, and the Q was connected to the first component of the first rotor, and then the W was connected to the next one, and then the E was connected to the next one. The military version obviously hadn't been connected up the same way. Now there's 26 factorial different ways of connecting this up. And Rejewski was just in despair, and he thought, I wonder if they've just connected A to A and B to B, and they did. The only thing that was possible to crack was exactly what they'd done in the military version. Unbelievable. So anyway, this small amount of inspiration, and suddenly they actually had not only a complete working version, but one that matched what they had, and they could actually read the German messages. And that was in 1933. 1934, Turing graduated with honours in mathematics from King's College, Cambridge. He had done very, very well there, and in fact in 1935 he published a paper in which he proved the central limit theorem. Do you know who knows what the central limit theorem is? Just a very small number. Okay, the central limit theorem is why statistics always comes out with a bell curve. It doesn't matter what the probability is in a system. If you take loads and loads and loads of samples, they always end up looking vaguely like the normal distribution, the bell curve, the Gaussian distribution. Yet another thing named after Gauss. That always ends up being like that. And this is a very big theorem. It's called the central limit theorem. And on the basis of that, Turing was actually awarded a fellowship at King's College. So he was now employed at King's College. Somehow it escaped everybody's notice that the central limit theorem had in fact been proved in 1922. But his proof was different. It was new and it used slightly different principles. So it was an outstanding piece of work which did not build on the previous work, even though it replicated the previous result. So in 1935, he became a fellow of King's College based on the central limit theorem. And at that point, he started to look at Hilbert's decision problem, the one that Hilbert published 7 years earlier in 1928. This one which says, here we are, here's a statement, can you come up with a mechanical process for deciding whether it's true or false? And he started working on that when he was a fellow at King's, 1935, and he solved it. He actually came up with a solution. And the problem is with this, you have to devise a way of thinking about methods of solving mathematics problems in general. So it's not enough just to solve a problem, you have to come up with a method of solving problems. And this was the birth of the Turing machine that some of you may have heard of, which is a theoretical construct that we use to talk about computation. And he wrote his paper and he sent it in to be published, and they said, oh, well, this was solved 2 months ago by Alonzo Church at Princeton University in America. Now, Church actually used an entirely different system. I'm going to deliberately conflate two ideas here. I'm not going to tell you the difference between them. There's an idea called recursive function theory, and there's an idea called the lambda calculus. How many of you have heard of the Lisp processing system, the Lisp programming language? Lisp is basically the lambda calculus, except the modern versions of Lisp aren't, but the original Lisp was basically the lambda calculus. And so Alonzo Church came up with this method of talking about computation. Turing had something completely different, totally different. But he rewrote his paper, he redrafted his paper in order to refer back to Church's results and to compare and contrast, and so he added that section, and then that got published. And so in 1936, when that was published, he went to Princeton to work with Alonzo Church and other colleagues. And during that time, they showed that these three apparently different ways of thinking about the problem were the same. The Turing machine is, with a small amount of work, pretty much identical to the lambda calculus. And the lambda calculus is pretty much identical to the Turing machine. And recursive functions and the lambda calculus are very, very similar. That's why I'm kind of conflating the two things there. So he worked there for a couple of years. And again, he continued on with that work, although he got, at that point, he started to get interested in quantum physics as well, quantum mechanics, which at the time, of course, was still comparatively new. Quantum physics only came out in the 1920s. People still really didn't understand it. There were multiple formulations. There were the wave formulation and matrix mechanics and so forth, and it turns out that these are all equivalent to each other as well. Turing did quite a lot of work in that. He didn't make any contributions that are outstanding compared with other people, but it obviously laid the foundation for some of the other work that he ended up doing a little bit later down the trail. So after a couple of years at Princeton, he came back and he started to work for the government codes and ciphers section. We got a bit of feedback on this, can we? Yeah, so he started to work with the government codes and ciphers branch. This is still pre-war, this is 1938, but he was becoming interested in codes and ciphers, and he was clearly a clever person, and the government was clearly interested in having clever people working on these sorts of things. Oh, it was about that time, I'm not referring to my notes here at the moment, I should have mentioned this. Oh yes, in 1937, so the year before that, remember I talked about the Poles managing to create a duplicate machine, but they couldn't figure out how to decipher the messages because they couldn't figure out the settings for the day. And what would happen is you'd spin the wheels. And so you'd have 3 different letters, and that would be the initial configuration for the day. And that was different each day. But they managed to work out that they could have a table of characteristics, which when they looked at the coded messages, they tried to find various characteristics within it, look it up in their codes, and that would give them clues to the initial settings. And in 1937, and remember they duplicated the machine in 1933, so this is 3 to 4 years of work producing this table of characteristics. In 1937, they finally completed that. And 2 months later, the Germans changed the machine. This was a bit frustrating. And so one of the things that they did was change the procedure in the way the machine was used. They ended up changing the machine a little bit more later on. So the Poles, of course, at this point get frustrated again. And of course, this is a real problem. And even more, the problem is that in 1938, very early 1939, they added 2 extra rotors. So now the machine still used 3 rotors, but it was 3 chosen from 5. And so you had 5 choices for the first, 4 choices for the second, 3 choices for the third. There were 60 possible choices of which rotors to use. And then you had your setting. And at this point, the Poles were getting even more worried about what was happening in Germany, obviously. And they were really strained as far as their resources were concerned, and they were very concerned that they weren't going to retain their independence much longer. And so I think it was in early 1939, there was a secret meeting in a forest between the French, the British, and the Polish, where the Polish Cipher Bureau handed over all of the information that they had about the Enigma machine. And I think that was in June 1939. So they managed to get ahead of the invasion by just 93 days. They made it. 93 is approximation. It might be 95. I can't remember. It's 3 months. But anyway, so then, of course, war started. And in September 3rd, or it might have been September 4th, I think it was September 3rd, Turing reported for duty at Bletchley Park, which was where the codes and ciphers people ended up being drawn to. There are stories told about Turing's time there. People recount various tales of what Turing did as evidence of his eccentricities. So the fact that he used to do quite a lot of cycling. When he had meetings with civil servants and that sort of thing, sometimes he would actually run to the meeting. And he would get there before the people who took public transport. He was a gifted long-distance runner. And much later, in 1947-48, it was only because of injury that he wasn't selected for the 1948 Olympics. He was a very, very high-quality athlete. When he would cycle into work during hay fever season, he would wear his gas mask to avoid getting hay fever. He used to keep his coffee mug chained to the radiator so that nobody else would use it. Now people recount these tales as evidence of his eccentricity. I think this is perfectly normal. And so does every other mathematician that I know thinks that this kind of behavior is perfectly normal, but there you go. And so he started working in Hut 8, which was where they were set to try to decode the Enigma machine. And over a period of time, he developed several techniques. He worked with quite a lot of other people. There are other people involved with this. Bill Tutt, Tommy Flowers are 2 names that pop up, but there were many others who were involved in this. But Turing's work, those who worked with him say that he was exceptional. It's important that we don't forget the contributions of the other people as well. But Turing was regarded as being exceptional in the work that he did. The insights that he had, the methods that he used, the techniques that he developed. You can read a lot about his actual time at Bletchley. That's been written up in many different places. I have a copy of Hodge's biography of Turing, it's a tome, but it's an absolute wealth of information of all of these sorts of things. It's very easy to find information about his time at Bletchley. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. The challenge that they faced, though, was that it was pretty much impossible to find the settings of the machine. And one of the big changes that had been made, now I told you that there were 60 possible combinations of which rotors to put in. In fact, later on, the Army added another 2 rotors, and then the Navy added a further 3 rotors to this thing. So the number of possibilities multiplied up. But the bigger problem was that they added a thing called the plug board. And this was the real challenge. So as I say, you can think of the Enigma machine as taking a letter, whatever the letter is. So if you want to say something like send help or send reinforcements, you start with an S, you put an S at the front, it goes through this scrambling system, gets reflected back, something else pops out. Notice I've said something else. No letter can ever be encoded as itself in an Enigma machine. If you have an X in your message, then in the ciphertext it will never be an X. This is actually a weakness in the machine. It's a crucial weakness of the machine, and I'll mention that in a moment. But what they did was they ended up with a bit of a scrambling system before the encipherment. Now there were 17,500 ways of setting up the rotors like this. Initially there were 6 ways of choosing which rotors to, which order to put things in. It ended up being 60. So 60 times 17,000 is 1,000,000. Right? So there are 10 to the 6 possibilities for setting up the rotors. But the plug board, there are 10 to the power of 11 ways of setting up the plug board. That's 100,000 million ways of setting up the plug board. So this extra million or so kind of, yes, it matters, but that's actually not the real problem. The problem was finding the settings for the plug board. And it was Turing's insights as to how to look at the various things. And this is where that weakness came up. Because what they did was they said, well, first message of the day is pretty much always going to be a weather report. So it's going to have the word wetter, W-E-T-T-E-R, in it, somewhere. And so you line up, here's your ciphertext. So I have no idea what this means. Completely random. By the way, sending ciphers in Morse code is really hard. If you learn Morse code, you learn clusters of letters. You learn how to send THE because that's one of the most common trigrams. And in fact, if you listen to Morse code, you can determine who is sending a message by listening to what's called their fist. It's like recognizing someone's handwriting. And the way they'll send THE, it no longer looks like THE. You know when you're listening to another language, you can't hear the gaps between the words until you get to know it really well. Well, in Morse code, you're sending random letters with the ciphertext. This is really hard. But anyway, that's a completely separate... Oh, by the way, they also didn't take a standard German phrase and then encode that. They would actually have code as well as the cipher. And that's another complication. But anyway, the word wetter almost certainly would turn up. So you put wetter underneath the ciphertext, and you find that there's a T in the ciphertext in the same place as there's a T in what you think it might be. And that can't happen. So wetter can't be there. And you move it on here and you find that actually it might live there. And if it is, then the E gets mapped to an X, and you might later on find that an X gets mapped to something else. And you start to get these chains of letters and loops of letters. And eventually you come back and you find that the X has to be matched to an A. But hang on a moment, I said that E was matched to X. And you can't have them matched in the same way. I'm only talking about the plug board here. I'm not talking about the whole ciphertext. So that you have to somehow manage to ignore the scrambling in the rotors and so forth. But this was what Turing did. This sounds complicated. This sounds hard to follow. It is, right? But he worked out ways of finding combinations that were going to be impossible. This is incredibly error-prone. So they built a machine to do it. And so they took the work that the Poles did on the Bombe machine, and they produced their own version. And they called it the Bombe, with an E on the end. We don't actually know why they called it a bomb. Some said it was because of the ticking noise, and some said after the dessert as just a code phrase or whatever. They've rebuilt the bomb. After the war, Bletchley had a bonfire, and they burned everything. But they've actually rebuilt the bomb. If you go and visit Bletchley Park, you can actually see the bomb in action. I'm not going to talk about exactly how it works, but they had one cylinder for each of the possible setups of the rotors, and this whole thing spun. And every time it found impossible combinations, it would just keep spinning. And as it settled down, it would find possible combinations that could then be analysed. And that was the work that Turing did. And of course, you can see his interaction with a mechanical device to do computations. And that was, again, that then chains into the work that he ended up doing later. So, one of the problems that they had was figuring out the initial settings. And somebody worked out a way of trying to get a hold of the German code books. It was going to be called Operation Ruthless. And what they were going to do was capture a German bomber, put in it SAS crew, crash it near a U-boat, and when the U-boat came to rescue them, take over the U-boat. It was called Operation Ruthless, and it was devised by Ian Fleming. So you can see where he got the plot for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. No, actually it's the plot from To Russia with Love. And this is actually, they never did it. And it says at one point that Turing and one of his colleagues came, they were crestfallen, like grave robbers robbed of a corpse, because they couldn't get it. And one of the things that the naval codes did, they actually wrote all of their code books in soluble ink. So they could actually just chuck them overboard. And even if you rescued it, you wouldn't get the settings from it, so you wouldn't know it. But anyway, Operation Ruthless never actually happened. Things went horribly wrong. Oh, guess what else happened shortly after that? The Germans changed the procedure. So they changed yet again how the machine was used. They removed one of the weaknesses. As it turns out, they put in another one, but they removed one of the weaknesses. So all of the work that had been done didn't work. And in fact, the German High Command used a completely different coding system. They used the Lorenz cipher, and other people started to work on that. So anyway, before the end of the war, I think 1943, Rejewski actually had escaped from Poland to France, and he escaped from France to Britain in 1943. He was never allowed to work on the ciphers, which I think was a waste of a brilliant mathematician who understood the systems, but I can understand why that would happen. Also at that time, Hans Thilo Schmidt, the spy who had passed the information, was exposed. He was found to be a spy, and he committed suicide rather than going through what he knew would happen to him. At this point, actually, Turing visited America for a while, and he was a consultant to security forces and he was working on trying to devise a speech encryption system, which was going to be called Delilah, so that Roosevelt and Churchill could communicate with each other by voice without having to go through these complicated systems. Never did quite work, but it was a brilliant idea. And as you know, Enigma messages were often being read by the people in Bletchley Park before they were read by the German commanders in the field. So efficient was the process. They say that they could read sort of 80 to 90% of the messages very, very quickly. Once they'd broken the code for the day, the settings for the day, they could just read all the messages. Shortened the war, they say, probably by 2 years, and no doubt saved hundreds of thousands of lives, if not millions of lives, in doing so. Churchill once referred to them as the golden goose that never cackled. And in fact, many of the people who worked at Bletchley suffered torment from the people that they were billeted on, who called them do-nothings. Because they couldn't talk about what they did. And they thought, here are fit and able people who are not doing anything for the war effort. They're hiding from the war effort. It must have been a dreadful thing. So in 1945, the war ended. Turing was awarded an OBE, and you think, what do you do now? Well, he went to work for the National Physical Laboratory on computing machines, electronic computing machines. In fact, the automatic computing engine, the ACE, is what he started work on. Some people said he was entirely useless at the engineering side of things. but it was actually due to his efforts working with very clever engineers. It's the combination. Now, my day job is actually involved, as was said earlier, in doing the equivalent of air traffic control, but for ships. And I do a lot of the theoretical work, and I could not do this without the guys who go in the field and make the kit work. It's the combination of skills that works. I actually told a story about people who had a disagreement while at the NPL. Who was it? It was Turing, Wilkinson and Richardson, wasn't it? Richardson were working on deciding whether or not they could actually program this thing to invert matrices, or whether the errors that would creep into this would grow. And apparently they were actually on a train journey discussing it. They came to blows over the question. So passionate were they about these sorts of questions. But you can see here the continuing growth of Turing's interest in computing, as well as in mathematics, as well as in the electronics side of things. In 1948, he was poached by Manchester. And at Manchester, he worked on the development of the very first, what is regarded by many as the very first stored program computer, which is referred to as just referred to as the baby. Never mind, it in fact weighed 1.5 tons and filled a room. They still called it the baby. And he worked in Manchester. And while in Manchester, he started to work also on a mathematical basis for morphogenesis, which is the changing of form from apparently formless or undifferentiated setups. I mean, why do giraffes have spots? Why do leopards have spots? But zebras have stripes, and angelfish have stripes. And as an angelfish grows, how do the stripes move, and how do they change? What is it that does this? And why is it that a leopard has spots, except when you go down its tail, they turn into stripes? And the end of a leopard's tail is always striped, not spotted. And so he worked on the reaction diffusion equations to work out how that could possibly do it. And he worked out the mathematics before he could actually then prove that it worked for everything. And these days, of course, we've got the machines, which were his child, to do the calculations to show that the theory that he did actually works. And it's related to chaos theory and dynamical systems and all sorts of stuff, which is still areas of ongoing research today. He also then looked at things like the pattern of seeds in sunflowers, which gives you the Fibonacci spiral and all sorts of things like that. And he did real, proper, hard maths as to how that stuff worked. And it's that area that's often forgotten because there's nothing really attached to him in those areas. But it was the basis of that work that gained him a Fellowship of the Royal Society. So he became an FRS, I think in 1951 or 1952. And he carried on with his work, but at about that time, he had his national security clearance removed because he was quite openly gay at the time. And there was some questions asked, and he ended up being prosecuted and convicted. His only defense was that actually what he was doing wasn't wrong. It was illegal, but it wasn't wrong. Of course, under law, that's actually no excuse. And so he was convicted, and rather than going to prison, he ended up having a series of hormone shots, which made his life really quite unpleasant. The work that he was doing was really his only escape at that point, and he did some brilliant work underneath that. But of course, it all ends very sadly. And 1954, he died in his home in Wilmslow. There is still debate. The inquest at the time said that he committed suicide. Looking at the descriptions of the circumstances, it's very hard to see it as anything other than suicide. But if you really want to, you can interpret the events as having been a terrible mistake. He was apparently doing chemical experiments, including with cyanide. Perhaps he happened to ingest some by accident. That's not the finding of the inquest, but that's what his mother always believed. Perhaps he set it up that way so that she could believe that rather than believing that he'd committed suicide. And so we lost a genius. And sorry, that's having read so much about him lately, that's quite sad. One of the last things that he did, very shortly before it though, was his publication of a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which he talks about the Turing test. How would you ever know if a machine was intelligent? How would you ever know that you should accord it rights? How would you ever know that it's something that you should regard as sentient? And he proposed an experimental way of doing it, a very concrete experimental way of doing it. And of course, technology has been creeping up on this. These days, you can go to Google and you can ask it questions and it will actually give you answers that make sense. If you've got an iPhone, you've got Siri on it, you can actually ask questions, you can almost carry on a conversation with it. The big test that people always thought was if it could play chess, then it must be intelligent. Been sneaking up on that for a long time. The world's checker champion, drafts champion, has been a computer for a long time. And of course, Deep Blue beat Kasparov, although it's been suggested there was actually a bug in Deep Blue's program which made it do something random, which made Kasparov not believe that it was actually the machine that was playing. There's argument continues. But the Turing test is one thing that we still have, that we're still sneaking up on. People who work in the area, some say it's just around the corner, and others who work in the area say it's a long way away. One of the techniques being used is neural nets, which Turing worked on in 1948. And we're still trying to use those to try to produce an intelligent system. So Turing's work is just sort of, all these fingerprints are all over these things. And it's not just his work at Bletchley. But also it's a combination of things. There's many things sort of tied together. There's streams of things that Turing sort of hopped between. And it's often said that this is what happens with the people who are the brightest of their age, is they cross across many different fields and start to tie them together. And it's the cross connections of the fields that actually end up being the most fertile ground. And certainly Turing was a most fertile mind. Thank you.